The words hit Belle Maddox like a bucket of ice water thrown across her face on the coldest morning of the year. "You lied to me." Levi Townsend stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, his broad frame filling every inch of the frame, his jaw set so hard she could see the muscle ticking beneath his stubbled cheek. His gray eyes, which had been so warm just 3 days ago when he had pressed his forehead to hers and whispered something she had been replaying ever since, were now flat and distant as a winter sky. Belle set down the iron skillet she had been holding and turned to face him fully. Her hands were trembling, but she would not let him see that. She had survived worse than a man's fury. She had survived worse than heartbreak dressed up in flannel and worn leather boots. "Levi," she said, and she kept her voice steady because that was the only thing she could control right now. "Don't." He raised one hand, palm out, a gesture that meant stop, a gesture that meant I cannot hear another word from you or I will break something I cannot put back together. "I found the letter, Belle, the one folded inside your Bible. The one you wrote to your brother telling him exactly what this ranch was worth and exactly where the deed is kept." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Because he was not wrong about the letter. He was deeply, catastrophically wrong about what it meant. But standing there with the smell of the biscuits she had made that morning still warm in the air, with the snow pressing itself white and absolute against every window of the Townsend ranch, Belle understood something terrible. She understood that a man who had spent the better part of his life being betrayed by the people closest to him would always look for the shape of betrayal even in the things that were real and true and given freely. She had fallen in love with him. Somewhere between the first frost and the deep of December, between burning biscuits and learning the names of every horse in his barn, between arguments about firewood and the night he had held her hand without knowing he was doing it, she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Levi Townsend. And now she had to figure out how to prove that to a man who had already decided she was just another trap. She pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at him straight. "Sit down," she said. "I am going to tell you everything, and when I am finished you are going to feel like the worst kind of fool, but I need you to hear it first." He did not sit, but he did not leave either. And that, Belle thought, was where this story actually began. It had started 4 months ago, in September of 1884, in the small railroad town of Denton, Colorado, when Belle Maddox had exactly 47 cents, a carpet bag with a broken latch, and a handwritten advertisement clipped from the Denton Courier that read, "Wanted, cook. Townsend Ranch, Cedar Falls, must be capable, sober, and willing to winter over. Fair wages. Inquire with W. Farley at the Grain Exchange." Belle had inquired. She had done so with the particular kind of determination that only comes from having no other options. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 2 years cooking for a boarding house in Kansas City after her husband, Thomas Maddox, had drunk himself off a cliff on the Flint Creek Road during a thunderstorm in the spring of 1882. Thomas had not been a cruel man. He had simply been a weak one, and the difference had not mattered much to Belle at the end. She was left with nothing but the name and the skills she had always had, and she packed those into her carpet bag and went west because west was the only direction that still felt like a possibility. Kansas City had been tolerable. The boarding house mistress, Mrs. Holt, had been a fair woman who paid on time and did not pry. But when Mrs. Holt died of pneumonia in August of 1884, the boarding house was sold to her nephew from St. Louis, who had looked at Belle with eyes she did not like, and offered her a new employment arrangement she liked even less. So Belle had taken her 47 cents and the advertisement and the carpet bag, and she had climbed onto the westbound train. The Grain Exchange was a low building that smelled of dust and mule, and W. Farley turned out to be a weathered man of about 60 with a tobacco-stained mustache and the squinting eyes of someone who had spent decades assessing things for their practical value. He assessed Belle the same way. "You cook?" he asked. I have been cooking professionally for 2 years and for my family before that, Belle said. Bread, stew, preserved goods, pies, roasted meats. I know how to stretch a larder through a long winter. You drink water and coffee. You're a widow. I am. He nodded slowly. Townsend's a hard man to work for, he said. Not mean, just particular. Lost his last cook to marriage in August and his housekeeper to a son in Denver before that. He's going into winter with nobody to run the domestic end of things, and he's got 3 ranch hands to feed besides himself. How many in the household otherwise? Belle asked. Just Levi. His wife passed 4 years ago. He's got no children. Farley paused. He's 32, good-looking enough that it might give you ideas. I'd advise against the ideas. Belle met his eyes calmly. I'm not looking for ideas, Mr. Farley. I'm looking for wages and a roof. He had hired her on the spot. The wagon ride out to Cedar Falls took the better part of an afternoon, driven by one of Levi's hands, a young man named Cal with red hair and a cheerful disposition who told her everything about the ranch that Farley had not. It was 2,000 acres of high country cattle land. Levi Townsend had inherited it from his father at 22 and had spent the last decade building it into something that the county respected. He was known as a careful man, a cautious man. He did not take risks, did not gamble, did not make promises he had not already figured out how to keep. Lost his wife to childbed fever, Cal said, not unkindly. Changes a man. He was different before from what the older hands say, more open. Now he's just. He searched for the word. Careful. Belle watched the high country landscape open around her. The mountains were beginning to put on their autumn color, all that gold and rust and deep amber, and the sky above them was the particular blue that only exists at altitude. She thought about careful men and what they were actually being careful about. She thought that whatever Levi Townsend was guarding, she had not come here to touch it. She had come to cook. The ranch house was larger than she expected, built from good timber with a wide covered porch that ran the full length of the front. There were 2 outbuildings, a substantial barn, a bunkhouse, and a fenced kitchen garden that had gone to seed in the September chill. Behind the house, the mountains rose up close enough that she felt she could reach out and set her hand on them. Levi Townsend was standing on the porch when the wagon pulled up. Belle had expected a man who looked careful. She had not expected a man who looked like that. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work for their living, with dark hair that had gone slightly long at the collar and those gray eyes that were watching her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was also not warm. He was wearing work clothes, canvas trousers, and a worn flannel shirt, and he was holding a coffee cup that he had apparently forgotten he was holding. He came down the porch steps as she climbed down from the wagon. "Mrs. Maddox," he said. His voice was low and even. "Mr. Townsend," she said. They looked at each other for a moment with the kind of plain assessment that people in practical arrangements allow themselves. "I'll show you the kitchen," he said. The kitchen was the room that Belle would come to love most in her entire life. It was large for a ranch house, with a good iron stove, a deep stone sink, a long work table, and shelves that ran floor to ceiling on the east wall. The larder beyond was well stocked and sensibly organized. Whoever had cooked here before her had known what they were doing. "The hands eat at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening," Levi said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Sunday mornings I expect something that acknowledges the day of the week. I don't require church attendance. The stove can be temperamental in the cold months. The well doesn't freeze, but the pump handle can. Your room is through that door." He pointed to a door at the far end of the kitchen. It led to a small, clean room with a window that faced east and a bed with a good wool blanket. "This is acceptable," Belle said. "Good," he straightened. "I eat simply. I am not a man who requires entertainment at meals. I expect the work to be done, and I will pay fairly for it." "Mr. Farley mentioned fair wages," Belle said. "I would appreciate knowing the specific figure," he told her. It was more than she had expected. She almost said so. Instead she said, "Agreed. I will start supper." He blinked just slightly. As if he had expected negotiation or complaint, she turned to the larder instead. Supper that first night was beef stew with cornbread and a dried apple pie that Belle made from a bag of apples she found at the back of the larder shelf. She fed the hands first at the long table in the kitchen, Cal and two older men named Dutch and Pemberton, and then she set a plate for Levi in the dining room because that was clearly the habit of the house. She did not expect him to appear in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes after she had served him. "This is the best cornbread I've eaten since my mother died," he said. Belle looked up from scrubbing the stew pot. "Thank you," she said. He stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went back to the dining room. Belle filed that moment away carefully and went back to the pot. October arrived with cold mornings and brilliant afternoons, and Belle settled herself into the rhythms of the Townsend ranch with a thoroughness that surprised even her. She revived the kitchen garden long enough to bring in the last of the kale and the root vegetables before the first hard frost. She learned the stove's temperament the way you learn the temperament of a difficult person, with patience and attention and the willingness to be surprised. She put up the last of the summer preserves, organized the larder with the winter provisions that Cal hauled in from Denton on the weekly supply run, and established a cooking schedule that kept 4 hungry men fed from dawn to dusk. The hands were easy. Dutch had a weakness for cinnamon and Pemberton ate anything without complaint, and Cal talked constantly, which meant the kitchen was rarely quiet in the mornings, which Belle found she liked. Levi was less easy, not difficult precisely, just present in a way that required ongoing navigation. He had a habit of appearing in the kitchen at odd hours, not intruding, never helping himself to anything without asking, just appearing. Standing in the doorway with his coffee cup or his hat in his hands, looking at nothing in particular, until Belle would say something or he would think of something that needed saying, and then the conversation would happen in that low, careful way he had. She learned things about him incrementally, the way you learn a landscape by walking it repeatedly. He had grown up on this ranch and had never lived anywhere else. He had briefly attended a school in Denver at 15, sent by his father for what the older man had called polishing, and had hated every minute of it. He had come back and never left again. His wife, Margaret, had been a girl from Cedar Falls itself, and he had known her all his life before he married her. He spoke of her rarely, and when he did it was with the particular careful grief of a man who has decided that grief is a private country that no one else is invited into. He read. That surprised Belle more than anything. He had 3 shelves of books in the room off the parlor that he called, without any self-consciousness, his library, and he went in there most evenings after supper and she could see the light under the door. "What do you read?" She asked him one morning in October when he came in for coffee and found her looking at the shelf of books visible through the open library door. He named several titles, history mostly, a few novels, 1 volume of poetry that he mentioned last and with slightly less confidence than the others. "Poetry," she said, and she kept any particular expression out of her voice. "My mother's," he said. "I haven't actually read most of it." "Which ones have you read?" He looked at her with those careful gray eyes. "Whitman," he said. "Some." Belle nodded and returned to her bread dough. He stood in the doorway for another full 30 seconds before he went out to the barn. November came like a door closing. The first real snow arrived on the 4th of the month and did not leave. The mountains disappeared behind heavy clouds and the world contracted to the ranch buildings and the 100 yards between them and the fence line. The road to Cedar Falls became impassable by the 2nd week, and the supply run shifted to a monthly trip on horseback. They were, in the plainest possible sense, stuck with each other. Belle found that she did not mind as much as she had expected. The kitchen became, gradually and without any particular intention, the heart of the house. The hands spent more time in it than they strictly needed to when the outdoor work was done, playing cards at the long table, and Levi would sometimes sit with them, not playing, just present, with his coffee and his careful listening expression. She started leaving a pot of coffee on the stove at all hours. It seemed the right thing to do. One evening in mid-November, Pemberton's hands began to shake badly enough that he dropped his cards 3 times and finally admitted that his old injury from a horse fall was acting up in the cold. Belle heated a cloth and applied it to the joints without being asked, and the old man looked at her with such naked gratitude that she had to look away. She felt Levi watching her from across the room. When she looked up, he did not look away. "You trained as a nurse?" he asked later when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse. "No," she said, "but my mother was sick for a long time before she died. You learned to manage." He was quiet for a moment, standing at the stove with his empty coffee cup. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. He tried again. At the end, she was in a great deal of pain and there was nothing to be done about it. The doctor came twice from Denton, and both times he had nothing helpful to offer. He paused. "I did not know how to manage." Belle looked at him carefully. This was more than he had ever offered, and she understood instinctively that pushing on it would close it. "No one knows how," she said. "Not really. You just do the next thing that's needed." He looked at the bottom of his cup. "Yes," he said. "I suppose that's right." He said good night and went to his library. Belle washed the coffee cup he had left on the counter and thought about the particular loneliness of cautious men. The snow deepened through November, and the days shortened until the light was only a brief bright interruption in the long dark. Belle baked more in cold weather. She had always been that way, and the kitchen smelled of bread and cinnamon and roasted meat on a nearly constant basis, and she noticed that Levi seemed to find more reasons to be in the house. He started helping with things that were not his responsibility. Small things at first. Carrying in extra wood without being asked. Fixing the pump handle when it froze so she did not have to fight it in the cold. Reaching things on the high shelves because she was not particularly tall and he was. She thanked him each time. He nodded each time. Neither of them mentioned it as a pattern, but it was a pattern and they both knew it. The evening in late November that changed the quality of things between them was a Thursday. Belle knew it was a Thursday because she always made soup on Thursdays, a habit from the boarding house. She was standing at the stove stirring a beef and vegetable soup when the door from the main house opened and Levi came in carrying a book. "I found this in the library," he said. "I thought you might want it." It was a cookbook. Not a ranch cookbook. Not a practical frontier text, but an actual proper cookbook with recipes that required things like cream and nutmeg and thyme. Belle took it and turned it over in her hands. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "Margaret brought it from her mother's," he said. "It's never been used much." Belle opened it carefully. The pages were crisp and mostly unmarked except for a small number of pages at the beginning where someone had written annotations in a neat hand. "She marked these," Belle said. "Yes," he looked at the open page. "She meant to try them, I think. She liked to cook but never had much time for the complicated things." "May I use it?" He looked surprised, as if the question had not occurred to him. "Of course I gave it to you." Belle set the book carefully on the shelf beside her own notes. "Thank you," she said. "I will take care of it." He stood there in the kitchen with his hands empty now and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not sadness exactly. Something more complicated than sadness. "She would have liked someone like you here," he said. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Belle did not say anything for a moment. She stirred the soup. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He talked for an hour. It was the most she had ever heard him say at one time. He talked about Margaret Townsend, born Margaret Carey, who had been small and quick and impatient with nonsense, and had laughed too loudly for polite company, and had loved this ranch in the complete uncomplicated way that only people who have never wanted to be anywhere else can love a place. He talked about the way she had died slowly, and the way the house had felt afterward, and the way he had learned to manage by simply removing all the things that were not necessary for work and focusing on that. Belle listened. She fed the soup and listened and did not offer comfort because she could feel that he did not want comfort. He wanted to be heard, which is a different thing entirely. When he stopped talking, the kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind pushing against the windows. "You've kept everything exactly as it was," Belle said finally, carefully. "Yes. Is that helping?" He was quiet for a very long time. "I thought it was," he said at last. She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and something shifted in the quality of the silence between them. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to exactly. But something changed, like ice beginning to give at the edges, slow and almost soundless. She served him his soup, and he ate it at the kitchen table, which was not his habit, and they talked about other things, practical things, the supply situation and the health of the cattle, and whether the pass would be navigable before Christmas. By the time he left the kitchen, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Belle washed the bowls and sat at the table with her coffee for a long time after. She told herself very firmly that she was not going to make this into something it wasn't. She was not entirely convincing. December came in hard, with temperatures that dropped below zero in the first week and stayed there. The cattle had to be checked twice daily, and the hands came in from the barn with ice in their beards, and the particular exhausted grimness of men working in genuine cold. Belle developed a system for this. Hot coffee waiting when they came in from the morning check. A substantial midday meal instead of just a light one, because men working in cold weather burn through food like furnaces. She started baking 2 loaves of bread each day instead of one because the bread disappeared as fast as she made it. She also started paying more careful attention to what Levi needed specifically, which she refused to examine too closely as a fact about herself. He had a particular way of moving when he was tired versus when he was simply quiet. He drank his coffee faster in the mornings when the work ahead was difficult. He went to the library earlier on the evenings when something was bothering him, not later, which she found counterintuitive but accurate. She started leaving something extra for him on the kitchen table on the evenings he went to the library early. A piece of pie or a slice of cake or just a small covered dish of whatever was good from supper. She did not make a production of it. She simply left it there. He never mentioned it directly, but it was never untouched when she came to collect it in the morning. The third week of December brought a storm that lasted 4 days. The snow came sideways and the wind made sounds that Belle associated with genuine danger, and the ranch contracted to an even smaller circle. The house, the barn, the corridor between them. The hands had extra duties keeping the cattle alive and coming in only to eat and sleep. Levi was outside most of each day and came in each evening so cold and tired that he sat at the kitchen table and could barely speak. On the second evening of the storm, Belle put a bowl of soup in front of him and then, without thinking about it too carefully, poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. He looked up. "You don't have to keep me company," he said, but it did not come out as a dismissal. It came out as something closer to wondering why she would want to. "I have been in this kitchen all day," Belle said. "I want to talk to another adult human being." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "What do you want to talk about?" "Anything," she said. "Tell me something about this ranch that I don't know." He thought about it. Then he told her about the spring that fed the East Creek, the one that had been there since before his father built the house, and how his father had chosen the location specifically because of it. He told her about a summer when he was 12, and the creek had flooded and come into the root cellar and ruined half the winter stores, and how his mother had simply looked at it, said, "Well," and started organizing what could be saved. He told her that there was a meadow on the north end of the property, accessible only in summer, that was completely filled with wildflowers in July, and that he had gone there every year since he was a boy because it was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. "I would like to see that," Belle said without thinking. He looked at her. "It's a long ride," he said, "in summer." "I ride," she said. I know. He had seen her, she knew. She had borrowed one of the ranch horses on a Sunday afternoon in October, just for an hour, just to feel the movement under her again. "I used to ride every day," she said, "before Kansas City." "Where were you before Kansas City?" She told him about Missouri. about growing up on a farm outside St. Louis with 3 brothers and a mother who had cooked for 11 people 3 times a day and had never once complained about it. About learning to bake bread at 7, and to slaughter a chicken at 8, and to put up preserves at 9, because those were simply the things you learned. About her father, who had been a good man with a good laugh and who had died of fever when she was 16, leaving the farm to her eldest brother, and how that had felt like the end of a particular kind of safety. She did not talk about Thomas. She was not ready to talk about Thomas. Levi listened the same way he did everything, carefully and completely. "You miss the farm," he said when she had stopped. "I miss having a place that is mine," she said honestly. "I have not had that for a long time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his empty soup bowl. "This ranch," he said slowly, "has felt like it was someone else's for 4 years." She understood exactly what he meant. They sat in the kitchen for another hour, just talking, while the storm pushed against the windows. At some point during that hour, Belle became aware that this was the most comfortable she had felt in the presence of another person since she could remember. Not exciting, not nervous, not performing. Simply comfortable, as if she had been given permission to take up exactly as much space as she actually occupied. She thought about that later, lying in her small room while the wind moved around the house. She thought about cautious men, and what happened when their caution began, slowly, quietly, to let something through. Christmas came on a Thursday that year, which meant it coincided with Soup Day, and Belle decided that Christmas required more than soup. She had been planning it for 2 weeks with the resources available to her, and she had managed to produce a roast of beef from one of the yearlings Dutch had slaughtered in early December, a dried cherry cake using the last of the cherries she had put up in the fall, 2 kinds of pie, roasted potatoes and onions, and fresh bread that she started at 4 in the morning, so it would be perfect by noon. She had not expected Levi to appear in the kitchen at 4:30. He stood in the doorway in his work clothes, looking at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. "You started without help," he said. "I start everything without help," she said. "Would you like coffee?" Yes. He came in and poured it himself, which he had stopped doing sometime in November. He sat at the table. "What can I do?" She looked at him. "You do not need to do anything, Mr. Townsend. This is my job." "It is Christmas," he said, "and I am already awake." "And I would like to help." She set him to peeling potatoes. He did it badly at first, taking too much flesh with the skin, and she corrected him with the same matter-of-fact instruction she would give anyone, and he adjusted without complaint and did it better. They worked together in the kitchen for 2 hours while the house was still dark and the Christmas morning cold pressed against the windows. Levi was not a natural cook, but he was methodical and willing to be corrected, and he did not get in her way, which were the 3 qualities she valued most in a kitchen assistant. At one point they were standing side by side at the work table, Belle shaping bread dough and Levi chopping onions with more care than was strictly necessary, and she realized their shoulders were almost touching. She did not move away. He did not move away. "When I was a boy," he said, chopping steadily, "my mother made apple butter every Christmas morning. She started it the night before and let it go overnight, and the whole house smelled of it when we woke up." "Do you have apple butter in the larder?" Belle asked. "I think so. I haven't looked." She found it on the 3rd shelf, 2 jars of it from the previous year's put-up with a label in a handwriting that was not her own. She brought one to the table without saying anything. Levi looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said quietly. She went back to her bread dough. "It should go with the rolls," she said. "I'll make rolls." Christmas dinner was the best meal she had made since coming to the ranch, and it showed in the way the hands ate it. Even Pemberton, who said nothing and ate everything, paused at the end and looked at Belle and said, "Mrs. Maddox, that is a fine meal." Levi said nothing during supper, but afterward, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Belle was clearing the table, he came and stood beside her and picked up a stack of plates. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. They washed the Christmas dishes together in a companionable silence that felt, Belle thought, like something that had been building toward itself for a long time. When it was done and the kitchen was clean and the stove was banked for the night, Levi went to the library shelf and came back with a small package wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the kitchen table. "Merry Christmas," he said. Belle looked at it and then looked at him. "You didn't need to do that." "I know." He said it the same way he'd said the same words 10 minutes ago, with the same slight weight to it that meant yes, but I chose to. She opened it. It was a book. A new one, not from his library, which meant he had ordered it specially from somewhere. It was a collection of American poetry, Longfellow and Whitman and several others she knew. "I know you read," he said. "Cal mentioned you brought books in your bag." "I did," she said. She held the book in both hands. "Thank you, Levi." It was the first time she had used his first name. She had not planned it. It simply came out of her, natural as breathing. He stood very still for a half-second. "You're welcome, Belle," he said. She looked down at the book so she did not have to manage what her face was doing. The first week of January was when Belle wrote the letter to her brother. Her eldest brother, Daniel Maddox, was the one who had taken over the farm after their father died, and while they had not been close in adulthood, they had maintained a correspondence. Daniel had written to her in November with the news that his eldest boy had been asking about opportunities out west, and could she point him in any direction. Belle had been thinking about it for weeks. The Townsend ranch had no positions currently open, but she knew from conversations with Cal that there were at least 2 other operations in the Cedar Falls area that were expanding in spring and might be looking to hire. She wrote Daniel everything she knew about the region, about the geography and the cattle prices and the general health of the ranching economy in the area. She wrote him what she knew about the Townsend Ranch because it was the thing she knew best: its 2,000 acres, its location near the spring-fed creek, its well-kept records. She wrote it all in the careful manner of someone providing useful information to a family member. She folded the letter and put it inside her Bible, which was where she kept all her correspondence before mailing it, because it was the flattest solid thing she owned and paper kept better without creasing. She meant to send it on the next supply run. She forgot. The supply run was delayed by weather. December's letter became January's letter, and she put it down somewhere and picked it up and put it in the Bible and forgot again. And then Levi had found the Bible when he came in one afternoon in February while she was out checking on Pemberton's hands, which had gotten worse again, and he had seen the folded paper and opened it because the cover of the Bible was damp from where she had set it near the stove, and he thought something might be ruined. He had read the letter. He had read it with the eyes of a man who has been deceived before, who has learned to find the shape of deception in even innocent things, who has spent 4 years keeping himself protected by seeing threats early. He had read a letter about the ranch's location and its land value and the deed, and he had seen a blueprint. And that was how Belle had come to be standing in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table, while the man she loved looked at her like she was a stranger. "The letter was to my brother," she said now, keeping her voice level and her eyes on his face. "Daniel Maddox of the Maddox farm outside St. Louis. His oldest boy, my nephew Joseph, is 20 years old and wants to come west. Daniel asked me in November if I knew of opportunities. I wrote him what I knew. I wrote about this ranch because this is the ranch I live on and it is the thing I know best. I was not providing information to anyone with designs on your land." Levi stood in the doorway and said nothing, but he was listening. "The reason the letter is still in my Bible," she continued, "is that I forgot to send it on 2 successive supply runs, and then it stopped mattering because I had already had a conversation with Cal about Joseph, and Cal had written to a ranch up by Salida that might have spring positions, and that seemed more productive than my letter anyway." She stopped. She let the silence hold. "My dark past," she said quietly, "is a dead husband who drank and a boarding house that I left because the new owner made it necessary. I have no hidden motive here, Levi. I came for the wages and the roof. I stayed because—" She stopped. He looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted. The flatness was not entirely gone, but there were cracks in it. "Because," he said. She was done being careful. Because this ranch started to feel like the place I told you I had not had in a long time, she said. And because you are the most honest person I have met in years, even when your honesty makes you unreasonable. And because I am not a woman who does foolish things, and somewhere in the middle of this winter, I did something very foolish and I am not able to take it back now. He was absolutely still. I am in love with you, Belle said, and her voice was steady and clear, and she held his gaze without flinching. And I understand if you cannot trust that right now. But I need you to know that the letter was to my brother about my nephew, and it is still sitting in my Bible because I am a disorganized correspondent, and the only thing I have ever wanted from this ranch is the job you gave me. The silence stretched long enough that she had time to feel the full weight of it. Then Levi crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and he did something she had not expected from a cautious man. He cupped her face in both his cold, work-roughened hands and he said, "I am sorry," in a voice that was not quite steady. "I am sorry. I saw it and I didn't think. I have been waiting for something to go wrong. I have been waiting for the other shoe, and when I saw it you assumed," she said. "I assumed," he confirmed, "and I was wrong." She put her hands over his. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "Levi," she said. "I know," he said. "I know." He bent forward and pressed his forehead to hers, which was exactly what he had done 3 days ago that she had been replaying ever since, except this time he did not pull away. "I have been falling in love with you since October," he said quietly, as if it were a confession. "I have been fighting it because I thought I was imagining it. Because I thought the warmth in this kitchen was just the stove and the smell of bread, and I was just a lonely man who had been cold for too long." "It is partly the bread," Belle said honestly. He laughed. It was the realest laugh she had ever heard from him, full and unguarded, and it changed his face completely. "It is not only the bread," he said. She leaned up and kissed him. It was a simple kiss, not elaborate, not dramatic, just the press of her mouth against his in the warm kitchen with the snow outside and the stove ticking beside them. But it was the most natural thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with those gray eyes completely open for the first time since she had known him. No careful distance, no protective flatness, just him present and seen. "What happens now?" she asked. "I'd like to sit down," he said, "and have you tell me about your brother and your nephew, and I would like to hear all of it." She sat down. She told him everything. She told him about Daniel and the farm and Joseph, who was apparently a solid young man who had been working a mill outside St. Louis and wanted bigger country. She told him about the boarding house and Thomas, all of it this time, the whole truth of her life without editing for his comfort or hers. He listened the way he always listened, completely, and when she was finished he said nothing for a while, just sat with his coffee cup and thought. "Your husband," he said finally. "You don't speak of him with bitterness." "No," she said, "but he made you miserable." "He made himself miserable," she said, "and I happened to be there. It is different." He looked at her with a particular expression that she was learning to read as the face he made when she said something that surprised him. "You are," he said slowly, "a very particular kind of person, Belle Maddox." "I have heard that before," she said. "I mean it as the highest compliment I know how to give." She reached across the table and touched the back of his hand. The winter deepened and warmed and deepened again, the way mountain winters do, with false hints of spring in February that vanished by the next week. But the quality of everything on the Townsend ranch had changed so thoroughly that even the hands noticed. Dutch, who was not a man who commented on personal matters, made an observation to Cal one morning while Belle was well within earshot, about how the boss was looking better than he had in years. Cal, who was not subtle, looked at Belle and grinned. Belle served Dutch an extra portion of bacon without commenting. Things between her and Levi were not sudden or dramatic. They were, appropriately for both their characters, slow and deliberate and deeply intentional. He brought her books from the library, not just the poetry collection now but histories and novels, and she read them and they talked about them in the evenings. He started teaching her the ranch accounts, not because she asked, but because he said he wanted her to understand how the operation worked, and she understood that this was its own kind of opening. She taught him to make bread. This was her idea, and he accepted it with the same willingness he brought to everything she suggested, and he was terrible at it initially. His hands too used to work gloves and tools to have the right sensitivity for dough, and she guided them with her own hands, and he stood very still and paid close attention to everything she showed him. "The dough tells you when it's ready," she said, pressing his fingers into the risen mass. "Feel that?" "No," he said honestly. "You will eventually." He looked sideways at her. They were standing very close because that was the nature of bread teaching. "How long did it take you?" "Years," she said cheerfully. He made a face that was almost a smile. She kissed his cheek without planning it quickly and turned back to the dough, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he turned back to the dough too, and neither of them said anything, and that was one of the best moments of her entire winter. In late February, Pemberton's hands got bad enough that he could not properly ride, and the question of the spring cattle drive became complicated. Levi handled it with his usual practical problem-solving, writing letters to 3 neighboring operations about a shared drive and negotiating terms with the straightforward efficiency that apparently characterized all his business dealings. Belle watched this from the kitchen table one evening where she was mending a shirt and he was writing letters, and she thought about what a strange and specific pleasure it was to watch a capable person be competent at their work. "You enjoy that," she said. He looked up. "What?" "The logistics of it, working out how to make difficult things work." He considered this. "I suppose I do," he said. "I find it satisfying when the pieces fit." "Is that why you are cautious?" she asked. "Because you need the pieces to fit before you move." He was quiet for a moment, his pen still in his hand. "My father was a man who moved fast," he said. "He made big decisions quickly and they came out right more often than not, but the times they came out wrong." He paused. "This land almost did not exist as a ranch. He had a partner early on who took him for everything he had once before he built it back. He was a different man after that. I grew up watching him manage that difference." "And you decided not to be taken," Belle said. "I decided not to be careless," he said. It was a distinction that clearly mattered to him. "But you are not your father," she said gently. He looked at her with those open gray eyes. "No," he said, "I am not. I am learning that." March arrived with a violence that surprised even the hands. 3 storms in the first 2 weeks that were worse than anything in February. And then, abruptly, on the 17th of the month, the temperature climbed and the snow began to melt, and the creek that fed the ranch ran high and loud with it. Belle stood on the porch in the first real warmth of the year, her sleeves rolled up and her face turned up to the sun, and felt the particular fierce joy of surviving winter intact. She heard the door behind her, and Levi came to stand beside her. They both stood there in the thin March sunlight, looking at the mountains where the snow was still white and heavy on the peaks but retreating from the lower slopes. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she confirmed. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I know that you came here for a winter position," he said, carefully and deliberately, in the tone he used when he had thought something through thoroughly before speaking. "And I know that the season is ending. And I know that you are a woman who is capable of making her own way and does not require—" "Levi," she said. He stopped. "Ask the question," she said. He took a breath. "Will you stay?" She let a beat of silence pass, not for effect but because she wanted to do this right. "That depends," she said, "on what staying means." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small ring, gold with a single small stone. It was not new, it had clearly been worn before. "It was my mother's," he said. "Margaret never wore it, she had her own. I have been keeping it because I did not know what else to do with it. And then I knew." Belle looked at the ring in his hand. "I am not a man who does things impulsively," he said. "You know that. What I feel for you has been growing since September, and I have examined it thoroughly, and I am certain of it in a way I have not been certain of anything in a long time. I want you to stay because I want to spend the rest of my life in the same house as you, and I am not interested in any lesser arrangement." "That," Belle said, "is the most methodically romantic proposal I have ever heard." He looked at her steadily. "Is that a yes?" She reached out and took the ring from his hand and put it on her own finger. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that she understood had been held for some time. Then he reached out and pulled her toward him with one arm, not roughly but firmly, with the deliberate warmth of a man who has decided that caution has its limits, and she went willingly into the circle of it. They stood on the porch in the March sun until the cold crept back up, and even then neither of them moved very quickly. They were married in Cedar Falls in April, in a small ceremony at the local church, with the 3 ranch hands as witnesses and the minister who also served as the town's schoolteacher on weekdays. It was a practical ceremony because they were both practical people, short and honest and directly worded, and when Levi said the vows he said them with the same absolute attention he brought to everything that mattered. Belle said them looking straight into his gray eyes. The celebration afterward was at the ranch, where Belle cooked the wedding supper herself, aided by Levi, who made the bread. It was better than his first attempts. She had been right that he would eventually feel it. The spring brought new challenges, as it always does in ranch country. The cattle drive that Levi had been organizing with the neighboring operations came together in May, with Levi and Cal and Dutch riding with the combined herd, while Pemberton stayed at the ranch with Belle on account of his hands. The 12 days of the cattle drive were the first 12 days since January that Belle had spent without Levi. She was surprised by how specifically she missed him. Not in a desperate way, not in an anxious way, but in the constant low hum of someone who has become accustomed to a particular presence and notices its absence the way you notice a sound only when it stops. She wrote him a letter, a real one this time, not the kind that got forgotten in a Bible. She gave it to the rider who went out with supplies to the drive camp on the 6th day. She got one back on the 8th day, brought by the same rider. His letter was short and direct, very like him. He wrote that the drive was going well, that Cal had proved more capable than expected, that Dutch was complaining about his knees in the cold mornings. He wrote that he was sleeping poorly. He wrote at the end that the camp food was making him appreciate what he had waiting for him, and then he crossed that out and wrote, "I miss you," which was better. Belle folded that letter and put it in her Bible, deliberately this time, in the front where she would find it immediately. When the drive came back in late May with a good price from the buyers in Denver, Levi came through the ranch gate looking trail-worn and saddle-stiff, and when he climbed down from his horse, Belle was there on the porch, and he came straight to her without stopping for anything else. He put his arms around her and held on. "The camp food was truly terrible," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I read your letter." She felt him laugh against her. They went inside, and she fed him a proper meal, and he ate it with the focused gratitude of a man who has been eating poorly. And he told her about the drive, and she told him what had happened on the ranch in his absence. And Pemberton watched them from across the table with an expression that she suspected was as close to sentimental as that particular weathered man ever got. That summer was the summer Belle finally saw the meadow on the north end of the property. Levi had promised it in November, and she had held the promise gently, not pressing, trusting that it would come true in its own time. It came true on a Saturday in July. He packed a lunch and saddled 2 horses, and they rode north through the high timber for 2 hours, talking and occasionally not talking, and then the timber opened and there it was. She had grown up on a Missouri farm. She had seen beautiful places. Nothing had prepared her for a mountain meadow in July at 8,000 feet, the wildflowers coming in every color she could name, the light falling through the thin air with a clarity that made everything look like it had been cut from something precious. Belle sat on her horse and looked at it for a very long time. "Well," Levi said beside her. "You were right," she said. "This is the most beautiful place." He was watching her face instead of the meadow. She felt it. You are looking at me instead of the flowers, she said. Yes, he said simply. She looked at him. His eyes were warm in the summer light and completely open, nothing held back, nothing carefully managed. Just Levi entirely present. I love you, she said. I love you, he said back, without hesitation and without complication. They ate their lunch in the meadow and lay in the grass in the afternoon warmth, and she rested her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat and the sound of the creek somewhere below them and the wind through the grass. And she thought that this was what she had meant when she had told him she wanted a place that was hers, not just four walls and a roof. This particular belonging. They rode home in the long summer evening light. That autumn in September, Belle realized she was expecting their first child. She told Levi on a Thursday evening in the kitchen while she was making soup, which she thought was appropriate since the kitchen was where everything important had happened between them. He went very still. She watched him carefully. She knew about Margaret. She knew what childbirth had cost him once. Levi, she said. I am fine, he said. He was not fine. His face was doing something complex and careful. She crossed the kitchen to him and put her hands on either side of his face, the same gesture he had made to her in February when everything had broken open. I need you to hear me, she said. I am strong and I am healthy and I intend to be very careful. We will get the best doctor that can be had, and I need you not to spend the next 8 months at a distance from me because you are afraid. He looked at her for a long moment. I am afraid, he said. I know, she said. That is allowed, but you are not allowed to disappear into it. He put his hands over hers. I will not disappear, he said. He kept that promise more faithfully than she had dared hope. He was present through the whole of the winter that followed, present in the way he did everything, thoroughly and quietly, and without making a production of it. He wrote to the doctor in Denver, the best one he could find with experience in difficult deliveries, and arranged for the man to come to Cedar Falls 6 weeks before the due date. He modified the kitchen stove arrangement so it was easier for Belle to work when moving became more difficult. He took over the heavier lifting without comment. The hands adapted their behavior with a naturalness that touched her. Dutch stopped swearing at the table, which she had never asked of him. Cal carried water without being asked. Pemberton, whose hands were better that winter thanks to a remedy the Denver doctor sent up in advance, built a small wooden cradle from leftover barn timber and left it outside the kitchen door without a word of explanation. Pemberton built us a cradle, she told Levi. He looked at the cradle for a moment. Yes, he said. His voice had something in it that he did not try to manage. The baby came in April, 3 days after the doctor arrived from Denver, in the long middle-of-the-night hours when the ranch was quiet and the spring rain was coming down soft and steady on the roof. Levi sat outside the bedroom door the entire time, which was the most frightened she had ever seen him be by not being able to do anything. The doctor emerged at 3 in the morning. Healthy boy, he said. Your wife is very strong. Levi stood up so fast he nearly knocked the doctor over. He was allowed in immediately. Belle was tired in the deep, absolute way of someone who has done something enormous, but she was upright against the pillows, and she was holding the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen, a small, red-faced, furious person who was already making his displeasure with the world extremely clear. Levi sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for what seemed a very long time. "Hello," he said quietly to the baby, in the same low, careful voice he used for everything that mattered. The baby opened one eye, seemed to assess this tall person, and went back to being furious about the world. Belle laughed until she was crying a little. Levi looked at her with his eyes very bright. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfect," she said honestly. He pressed his lips to her forehead. She felt his breath, which was not entirely steady, and she leaned into him. "What do we call him?" she asked. He had been thinking about this. She had not pressed him, had let him arrive at it. "James," he said, "for my father, if you agree." "James Maddox Townsend," she said, trying it. "James Daniel Townsend," he said, "if you want your brother in it." She looked at him. "He is the brother who sent you the advertisement," Levi said simply. I have reason to be grateful to him." Belle looked down at James Daniel Townsend, who had finally stopped being furious and was examining the ceiling with the focused interest of someone confronting their first genuine puzzle. "James Daniel Townsend," she said. "Yes." Daniel Maddox came out to Cedar Falls that August with his wife and his 3 children, including Joseph, who was now employed on the ranch up by Salida and doing well. Belle stood on the porch of the Townsend ranch and watched her brother climb down from the wagon and thought about the last time she had seen him, 7 years ago at their mother's funeral, both of them older than they should have been. He was heavier now and grayer, and when he came up the porch steps and looked at her, he said, "You look like yourself," which was the highest compliment Daniel Maddox knew how to offer. "Come inside," she said. "I'll feed you." Daniel and Levi regarded each other over the kitchen table with the particular wariness of 2 careful men, who are each trying to determine whether the other is trustworthy. By the end of the first evening, they were talking cattle prices. By the end of the second day, they were talking about the property Daniel was considering buying an hour north of Cedar Falls. By the end of the week, they had figured out a cooperative arrangement that would benefit both operations, and Daniel had shaken Levi's hand with the satisfied expression of a man who has found a business partner he can respect. Belle watched this from across the kitchen where she was feeding James his supper, a task that required a great deal of focus since James had developed strong opinions about what food items were acceptable and which were not. "You are very smug," Levi said to her, appearing at her elbow. "I am," she agreed. "I knew you would like each other. You did not know that." "I know Daniel and I know you," she said. The conclusion was not difficult. He took James from her to give her hands a rest, which James accepted with reasonable grace because he was already of the opinion that his father was one of the more interesting features of his world. "Joseph wants to come work here in spring," Levi said, settling James against his chest. "I told him I'd consider it." Belle looked up. "Truly, he seems solid, and Cal is talking about going to Wyoming, which will leave us short." "Levi Townsend," she said. He looked at her with his steady gray eyes and the particular expression that had replaced the old careful flatness, open and warm and entirely his. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I just love you." He said it back without hesitation, and James reached up and grabbed Levi's ear, and the moment dissolved into laughter. The second winter of their marriage was different from the first in every way that mattered. The kitchen was still the heart of the house, but it held more life now. James in his cradle near the stove during the day, the sounds of a full household rather than a cautious man, and a new employee navigating something they were not yet naming. Levi had changed. Not into a different person, but into a fuller version of the one he had always been. He laughed more often, the real laugh that changed his face, and he held his opinions with less defensive grip, willing to be persuaded or surprised. He still read in the library in the evenings, but now Belle often sat with him, her own book or her mending in hand, and they passed the quiet hours together in a companionship that was so easy and so good that she sometimes caught herself simply sitting with the fact of it. The way you hold something valuable for the pleasure of knowing it is yours. Joseph Maddox arrived in March as planned, a solidly built young man of 21 with Daniel's steady eyes and their mother's quickness. He was good with cattle and better with horses, and he integrated into the ranch life with a naturalness that told Belle he had found his country. He also had the very inconvenient habit, shared by all the Maddox men, of opinions delivered without warning at the table. "That bread is better than last week's," he said to Levi one morning in April. Levi looked up from his coffee. "Thank you," he said. "Did Belle make it or did you?" "I did," Levi said. Joseph looked impressed in the slightly startled way of someone recalibrating their assessment. Belle did not say a word, but Dutch caught her eye across the table, and she saw the old man suppress something that was definitely a smile. Spring lambs were what she had expected. Spring actually brought a late snowstorm in April that killed 3 calves, and required 3 days of continuous work from every man on the ranch, including Joseph and even Pemberton, who at 64 refused to be left out of any operation he considered his responsibility. Levi came in from the last of it gray with exhaustion and cold, and Belle put him in the chair by the kitchen stove and brought him coffee and hot food and sat beside him while he ate, and James, now almost a year old and of the walking adjacent conviction that the world was entirely for his exploration, pulled himself up on Levi's knee and regarded his father with great seriousness. "Calf," James said, or something that was approximately that. Levi looked down at his son. "Yes," he said, "calves. We saved most of them." James nodded as if this were satisfactory and began the process of trying to climb onto Levi's lap, which required assistance. Belle watched her husband hold her son and felt the completeness of it settle over her like the best kind of warmth, the kind that comes from inside and stays. By the following winter, Belle was expecting again. This time Levi was still afraid, but he did not go to any particular distance. He channeled the fear into practical preparation, which was so entirely characteristic of him that she found it more reassuring than any amount of verbal comfort. The second doctor was the same Denver man, who had clearly decided that the Townsend account was worth the distance. He arrived 6 weeks early again, set up the room that had become the guest room, and had the direct and businesslike conversation with Levi that she suspected only 2 practical men could have had about the details of childbirth. The second child arrived in February with considerably less drama than James had, which Belle attributed partly to practice and partly to this particular baby's apparently cooperative nature. She was a girl, pink and already looking thoughtful in the way some newborns do, as if they have arrived with opinions already formed and are waiting only to acquire the language to express them. Levi held her and looked at her with that same long, quiet attention he had given James. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like a 2-hour-old baby," Belle said, which was accurate. "Give her a week." "She will look like you in a week," he said serenely. Belle laughed. They named her Margaret Rose Townsend. Belle had suggested Margaret. Levi had gone very quiet for a moment, and then said yes, simply, with the clear and unmournful acknowledgement of a man who has found a way to carry his grief that does not require him to hide from it. Margaret Rose had inherited, it turned out, her father's serious gray eyes and her mother's tendency toward decisive opinions about the world, which made for a child who was simultaneously easy to understand and challenging to manage. James, who had strong feelings about his primacy in the household order, required some diplomatic handling when his sister arrived to contest it, but Belle had grown up in a house full of brothers, and she applied the Maddox approach to sibling management, which was essentially benign neglect of the competition and fervent encouragement of individual personality. By summer, James had largely accepted Margaret Rose as part of his world and had begun, in his 2-year-old way, to act protective of her, which made Levi's expression go soft in a manner that Belle collected privately and thought about often. Joseph, now an established member of the operation, had struck up a correspondence with a young woman in Cedar Falls, the schoolteacher's daughter, a fact that he had told Belle before he told anyone else, and she had kept his confidence until he was ready to say it aloud. When he finally told Levi over the accounts one evening in autumn, Levi looked at him for a moment and then said, "Clara Harmon is a good woman. Her father is honest." Joseph blinked. "You knew? This is not a large territory," Levi said, "and you have been to Cedar Falls 6 times in the last 2 months for reasons that don't involve supplies." Joseph looked at Belle, who kept her expression entirely neutral. "Clara Harmon is a fine person," Belle said. "You should stop being vague about your intentions." Joseph was married the following spring, in the same church where Belle and Levi had married, and they gave a party at the ranch afterward that lasted until well past midnight and included the best meal Belle had produced since Christmas of the first year. Pemberton, who was 70 now and working lighter but still present, sat in his usual chair and ate everything put in front of him and said at the end, with the weight of a man offering his highest commendation, "That was a fine party, Mrs. Townsend." Belle clinked her coffee cup against his. The Townsend Ranch, in its 7th year of Belle's residency, looked very different from the cautious, quiet property she had arrived at in September of 1884. It was still careful in the way Levi managed everything, the accounts precise, the cattle well tended, the buildings maintained. But it breathed differently now. The kitchen garden was a serious kitchen garden, expanded twice since the first year, with rows of vegetables and an herb section, and 2 apple trees that Belle had planted in the 3rd year, because she had wanted apple butter that was her own. The house had grown too, a wing added after Margaret Rose was born, 2 new bedrooms and a larger sitting room where the family spent winter evenings, Levi reading, Belle with her needlework or her own book, James now old enough to read himself at the table, Margaret Rose exercising her aforementioned decisive opinions about the world generally. Dutch had retired to a smaller place in Cedar Falls but came out for seasonal work and showed up for every major meal with the reliability of weather. Cal had come back from Wyoming after 2 years, which nobody had entirely expected, and was now foreman, which everyone had expected. Joseph and Clara lived on the property Daniel Maddox had eventually bought north of Cedar Falls, and ran it with the shared operation arrangement that Levi and Daniel had worked out back in the summer of their first meeting. Joseph came by twice a week, and had already demonstrated that he had inherited the Maddox talent for cooking, which Belle considered vindication of the family generally. Daniel himself had brought his family west permanently in 1887, and the Maddox-Townsend connection had become, in the close-knit way of ranching communities, a significant part of the local landscape. Belle was 35 in the 7th year of her marriage, and she stood at the kitchen window one morning in October and looked at the mountains, which were doing their autumn thing with the aspens, all that pure gold against the evergreen and the granite, and thought about September of 1884, about 47 cents and a broken carpet bag, and an advertisement clipped from a newspaper. She thought about what Farley had said about ideas. She thought she might write to him. He had retired from the grain exchange, but she knew where he was. She thought she would write and tell him that she had not followed his advice and that she was entirely without regret. She heard Levi's footsteps behind her, the specific tread of him that she had memorized the way you memorize things you love, and he came to stand beside her at the window. "Thinking?" he asked. "About the advertisement," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the aspens with her. "I wrote it 8 times before I gave it to Farley," he said. "I kept changing the wording." She turned to look at him. "Truly." "I could not decide," he said, with the slight self-deprecation he was capable of now in ways he had not been when she first knew him, whether to say willing to winter over or willing to commit to an extended stay. The first seemed too harsh and the second seemed too vague. "And you chose willing to winter over." "I chose the accurate one," he said. "I am a cautious man." "You are," she agreed. He looked at her in the October morning light with those gray eyes that she had been reading for 7 years and that still had the capacity to show her something new. "I am glad," he said, "that you answered it." She reached out and took his hand. "I am glad," she said, "that you were particular enough to make the coffee always available." He looked puzzled. "You put a pot on the stove at all hours," she said. "From October onward, you never made a point of it, you just always had coffee." He looked at her for a moment and she could see him considering whether to explain it. "I noticed," he said finally, "that you worked very early and very late and that you seemed to run on coffee, and I thought," he paused, "I thought that was a thing I could do." Belle looked at him. "Levi Townsend," she said. "What? You were courting me with coffee from October." He had the expression of a man who has been accurately described and is not entirely displeased about it. "I had not thought of it that way," he said. "I had," she said. He pulled her toward him with one arm and she went, as she always did, completely willingly, and they stood at the kitchen window in the October light while the aspens were gold, and the mountains were doing their annual magnificent thing, and somewhere in the house James could be heard explaining something to Margaret Rose with the particular authority of a 6-year-old who has decided he is an expert. "I need to start the bread," Belle said, without moving. "Yes," he agreed, without loosening his arm. They stood there another few minutes. The bread was fine. She started it a little later. That winter, their 7th together, was the mildest in memory, or so Dutch said on his visits from Cedar Falls, and the old hand seemed personally offended by this, as if mild weather were a kind of cheating. The cattle came through the cold months in better condition than usual, and the calves in March were healthy and numerous, and Levi walked the new calves with the satisfied expression of a man whose caution has been vindicated by good outcomes. James, at 6, was old enough to come with him on these inspections, which he did with the solemn dedication of someone taking on a serious responsibility. Margaret Rose, at 4, was old enough to be furious that James got to go, and she was told she had to wait until she was older, which she expressed in a manner that left no one in any doubt about her feelings. "She is exactly like you," Levi told Belle with some admiration. "She is exactly like your mother from the stories you tell me," Belle said. He considered this. "Yes," he said, "she is. God help us." They were sitting on the porch in the first warm evening of April, the winter finally releasing its grip, the creek running loud and cheerful from the melt, the ranch quiet in the way that evening in spring country is quiet, full of small sounds rather than absent of them. Belle had a cup of coffee. Levi had one too. The light was doing the long, slow western thing it does in April, lasting longer than seems possible, painting the mountains in colors that have no proper names. "I have been thinking," Levi said. "About what?" "About expanding the herd. Joseph has been running a smaller breed on the northern property that does better in the altitude, and I have been reading about the arguments for mixed operations." He paused. "And I have been thinking about the meadow." She looked at him. "The North Meadow. There is a spring up there," he said, "a reliable one. If we put a line fence along the east ridge, we could run cattle up there in summer and bring them down in fall. It would double our summer range." Belle listened to this and thought about the meadow full of wildflowers in July. "Not the whole meadow," she said. He looked at her. "Leave the center of it," she said, "the part by the creek where we had lunch that first summer." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yes, the fence can go around it." She nodded. "I want to take the children up there this summer," she said, "before any fences." "Yes," he said again, "I want to show them." They sat with their coffee while the light lasted, and then longer after the light was gone, because neither of them was in any particular hurry, and the porch was where they were, and the house and the ranch and the children sleeping inside, and the hands in the bunkhouse and the cattle in the pastures were all where they were supposed to be, and the spring air smelled of mud and new grass and the particular cold clarity of the mountains. It was, Belle thought, exactly the kind of evening you want to stay inside of. She thought about September of 1884 one more time, the train west and the advertisement and the long drive up to the ranch, and she thought about what Cal had told her, about a cautious man and what he had been before and what he had become. She thought that Cal had not had the whole picture. Levi Townsend had not simply become more open. He had become himself. The full version, the one that had always been there under the caution, waiting for the thing that would make the caution unnecessary. She had been that thing. He had been that thing for her. They had been that for each other, which was the only kind that worked. "What are you thinking?" he asked in the dark. "About the first winter," she said. "What about it?" "About the letter," she said. "About you standing in the kitchen with that expression." He was quiet. "I was so angry," he said, "and so afraid underneath the anger." "I know," she said. "And you stood there," he said, "and you told me to sit down." "You did not sit down." "No," he said, "but I stayed." He paused. "That was the moment, I think, when I realized I was not going to leave the kitchen. I could not have said it that way then, but I think that was when I knew." Belle reached over and took his hand. "I knew in November," she said, "when you told me about Margaret and I watched your face while you talked." I thought this man has kept himself so carefully and it has cost him so much. And, he said quietly, and I thought that if he ever decided to stop keeping himself so carefully, it would be worth the trouble of waiting. He was quiet for a moment. It was that calculated, he asked, and she could hear that he was almost smiling. It was not calculated, she said. I just knew, the way you know some things. She heard him exhale. The way I knew, he said, when I was writing that advertisement 8 times in the library that whatever came next was going to matter. She squeezed his hand. Did you know it would be me? She asked. No, he said honestly. I did not know what it was going to be. I just knew it was going to matter. The creek ran in the dark and the stars came out over the mountains and the spring night settled around them, soft and cool and enormously full. Belle held her husband's hand and listened to the creek and thought about how little she had known about anything when she stepped off that train with 47 cents and a carpet bag, and how much she knew now, and how none of the knowledge was the kind you could have gotten without the years and the work and the winter and the letter in the Bible and the bread and the coffee always on the stove. She knew, for instance, exactly how to make a cautious man feel safe enough to be brave. She knew that brave did not look the same on every person. She knew that a kitchen could be the heart of a life. She knew that wildflowers in a mountain meadow in July at 8,000 feet were exactly as good as they sounded when someone described them to you in November. She knew what she had not known at 26, that belonging is not a place but a practice, and that the right person makes it effortless. Come inside, she said when the cold had truly settled. Yes, Levi said. He held the door for her. She went in. The kitchen smelled of the evening's supper and coffee, always coffee, and the stove held its warmth long after the fire had gone to coals. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of a winter survived and a life chosen, of a cautious man who had finally let something through and found it was worth every careful year he had spent waiting for it. Belle Maddox Townsend stood in her kitchen in the April dark and knew, with the same certainty she had rarely permitted herself in the years before this place and this man, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Behind her, she heard Levi bank the stove for the night with the practiced hand of a man who has made peace with his house. She went to put the coffee on for morning. He came to stand beside her while she did. Neither of them needed to say anything else. The ranch held them both in its particular quiet, and outside the mountain stood enormous and old and indifferent to the small bright flame of 2 people who had found each other in the middle of a winter that had turned out, against all sensible expectation, into the rest of their lives.